Thank you to all of our presenters. I would like to invite you to join us here for Q&A. So there is a little discrepancy between the blocks. I have to point that out. So we're doing okay. All things considered.
Our next speaker is Mairéad, your children, from Dublin University.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks, everybody. So we're gathered here today for a conference entitled The Picturebook, Between Fiction and Reality. And in my presentation today, I'm very much focused on the between. So my research is eco-critical in nature, and consequently, I've read quite a bit of Timothy Morton's work. And this quote of his stands out: "Art happens in the liminal spaces between things." So what my presentation proposes, in line with Morton's contention, is that the aesthetic experience can be positioned as a meeting point between the natural and the cultural, the visual and the verbal, the material and the abstract, the fictive and the real. And in addressing this, I utilize two theoretical frameworks: material eco-criticism and intermediality, which have numerous points of intersection, as I hope to demonstrate in my application of these to two quite distinctive picture books here, which I will discuss in further detail in a few moments. But initially, to provide context, I'd like to briefly outline some of the main principles of my theoretical frameworks. So firstly, material eco-criticism has emerged as a fourth wave of eco-criticism over the course of the last decade. And its foundational premise, the turn to matter, emphasises the materiality of the world and everything social and natural within it. As articulated by Iovino and Opperman here, who referred to a vast network of agencies and material narratives that form our storied world. So I like this second point here, and it's probably the most fundamental point to my research, this reshaping of perceptions. So under such an understanding, all matter, and that goes beyond cute furry animals or pretty forests to include the gritty stuff like dirt, toxins, bacteria, bodies, all of this is inherently vital, not secondary or additional to human life, but something we are immersed in and enmeshed with. And if it's vital, it has agency. And this is a tricky concept because we've only ever associated agency primarily with humans. And this idea of changing perceptions calls to mind what children's perceptions of the natural world are, and how nature can often be represented in children's and young adult literature as a pretty backdrop, perhaps, or something that needs saving by us superior and knowledgeable humans. So physicist Karen Barad speaks of intra-actions and distributive agency, which departs from the standpoint of the human as a separate and superior entity, to instead understand the human as part of an interconnected, complex and dynamic web of materiality, emphasizing the relational aspect of agency. So the fundamental premise being that we are a part of the nature that we seek to understand. And I think it's important to state that matter as a site of narrativity has also been a fundamental belief in many indigenous cultures, including the concept of animism and the idea of stories as material objects in themselves. This ever-unfolding story of the world, how the stars and the rocks tell their own story. And Nicola, I know, referred to that yesterday when she was speaking about Matariki. So how is all of this relevant to literature, and specifically children's and young adult literature? Well, applied to literary studies, a material eco-critical approach looks for matter both in text and as a text. And in this sense, it's post-representational because it moves beyond a structuralist preoccupation with textual analysis and interpretation, and is more interested in the material force of language and image, which demands further consideration of terms such as medium and material. So Ripple notes that the narrow use of the term medium is now passé and has been replaced by a broad understanding of the term, which triggers an investigation of how meaning is generated by cross-medial references and allows for a systematic analysis of inter, multi and transmedial constellations. So bearing this in mind, a thorough consideration of the literature examines how the material side of the sign or semiotic system mediates or is involved in the production of narrative meaning. And this signals a departure from the structuralist belief of language as the master discourse of all media, and it sees the picture book as more than what Zapp refers to as derivative material for demonstrating the truth claims of theories. Rather, the picture book is itself an agentic force. And I propose intermediality as an effective and productive approach in examining these elements of the literature, as it analyses the relations between both form and content and how these relations support or challenge each other in the creation of meaning. And going back to this idea of the in-between, Ripple argues that the concept of intermediality, by opening up a space of semiotic and material in-betweenness, allows readers to experience, see, and imagine the world differently, and breaks down the related oppositions, binary oppositions between word versus image, or us versus them. So how is it different to traditional theoretical approaches in picture book studies, such as picture book theory, multimodality, or reader response theory? While concepts such as that of the iconotext have contributed important insight to picture book scholarship, much of this research tends to focus predominantly on text and image, often at the expense of the materiality and mediality of these texts, which can be subsidiary and under-researched in the field of visual narrative studies. An intermediate approach does not restrict its focus to a semiotic analysis of the iconotext. Rather, it compels us to ask, as Ripple does, how the material side of the sign or semiotic system is involved in the production of narrative meaning. So while acknowledging that other approaches greatly inform the theory of intermediality, we can also recognise that in its attention to the material, intermediality perhaps fills a gap. Expanding upon more traditional theoretical ideas to develop an understanding that art forms are composite, all media are mixed and diverse, and the creation of meaning rests not only on the relation between text and image, but also the convergence point of semiotics, the theory of signs and aesthetics, the theory of senses. As Henkel argues, children's literature should be seen in an intermedial culture. And it's also inextricably linked to material eco-criticism, most significantly in the concern of both approaches with the agency of matter and the material, and in their tendency to mediate between binaries. And Rajewski's model of narrow intermediality is one that I apply in my research and refer to in my presentation today. And this encompasses three subcategories: media combination, based on the combination of at least two medial forms of articulation, such as text and image, for example; medial transposition, the transformation of a given media product into another medium; and intermedial references, which describe references within one medium to another medium. So applying material eco-criticism and intermediality to visual narratives is a two-part endeavour. In simple terms, an exploration of matter in the text, the representational, and also a representation of matter as a text, so the post-representational, to include some of these points here. And under this understanding, the post-representational, books themselves are vibrant matter, demanding the reader to engage multiple material and sensorial modalities in a reciprocal communicative relationship. And this combined approach, taking into account both representation and post-representation, considers how the materiality supports or acts in tension with the iconotext to produce one entire integrated meaning, which I argue has transformative potential. So after all that theoretical speak, to dive into the more interesting topic of the books themselves, Then on Rufus, translated as The One About Rufus, is a Danish picture book published in 2021. The collaborative effort of 4 authors and illustrators who met as either teachers or students in the animation workshop at VIA University College in Viborg in Denmark. Herman Diete is actually the joint pen name of illustrators Celia Lin and Thomas Vium. It was nominated for the prestigious Nordic Council's Children's and Youth Literature Prize in 2022. And it tells the story of Rufus, a domesticated and anthropomorphized fox who lives a typical human-like existence in his flat in the city, enjoying TV in his armchair with cups of tea. But one night he strays into the forest where he meets a bunch of wild foxes, and before long his inner savage is unleashed, his wild and natural fox-like side. So the materiality of the book is noteworthy. Before the reader even... Quick. Before the reader even reads, there we go, thank you. Before the reader even reads a single word or peruses a single illustration, there is an awareness of the vibrant matter, the unique materiality of this book as object. It's not a typical picture book. It can be described as a comic picture book hybrid. This is evident in both its unusual size, smaller than a typical picture book, larger than a typical comic, and its aesthetic style. Expansive double-page spreads are combined seamlessly with comic book sequences. Speech bubbles work in tandem with lengthier sequences of narration. The illustrators use cinematic effects such as the panning in and out of the focus to excellent effect. It's approximately 50 pages. The pages are not numbered. The paper has a strong, weighty, textured feel. It's easy to hold for both child and adult, if anyone wants to look at it later. The text is handwritten and not both the cultural and the natural, written by a human hand, but more scrawled and wild than typical printed fonts. And although seemingly set in autumn, the book itself seems to aesthetically progress through the 4 seasons, beginning with cooler, greener shades of spring, moving to deeper hues of summer, blue hues, and then the in-between of autumnal shades, colder, darker, wintry shades at the end. The significant section of the book is depicted in autumnal colours, this migratory in-between phase of the seasonal cycle represented by Rufus's own in-between existence. The use of colour emphasises how the book as a material and medial object is itself a part of the natural process. Its aestheticism is as important in this regard as the actual narrative. The entire process and product are enmeshed with the thematic concerns of the fable itself. And there are numerous intermedial and intertextual examples, and I know intertextuality was discussed yesterday in the context of anthropomorphization also. So the character of Rufus is reminiscent of Roald Dahl's fantastic Mr. Fox, and indeed many of the illustrations are not dissimilar to those of Quentin Blake, who was Dahl's most widely known collaborator. Hannah Hen calls to mind the Disney character of Clara Cook, and indeed the depictions of the city with its countless chickens is reminiscent of Duckburg, home of to many of Disney's renowned duck characters. Intermediate references abound, such as the depiction of giant sculptures in the town centre, which seem to tell their own story. Or those of Rufus watching nature programmes on TV. Such intertextual and intermediate references allow the young reader to make connections with their world beyond the pages. The story becomes what Deleuze and Guattari might call rhizomatic in nature, an interconnected constellation of experiences, fictional within the pages, but grounded in the reality of the child's worldly existence. And we're all familiar with Picturebook's clever use of end paper space to contribute to the story. But in this case, the end papers relate an entire sequel to the events in the main body of the text, told through a clever combination of illustrated photos on the wall and the setting of the living room itself. So the front papers depict Rufus's solitary life. Here, told a single photo hangs on the wall. We see the accoutrements of his physical existence here. The end papers inform the reader through the photographs that Rufus and Hannah have actually developed a romantic relationship, have enjoyed pastimes and holidays together, have had offspring. But the setting beyond the frame photos here suggests that a more sinister outcome. Amidst these images of domesticated and content family life is a scene of carnage. What has happened here? We see scattered feathers, claw marks, upturned china, a broken window leading to the forest. Has Rufus embraced his wild side, reverted to nature? What is the fate of Hannah and their children? So this dark and challenging turn of events is cast in hues of blue, which gives a cinematic effect, reminiscent of how filmmakers cast certain scenes in blue tints, the colour of twilight, a time of transition, also a time that suggests impending darkness. And interestingly, the end papers also contain the only straight lines in the book, the wallpaper, a commentary perhaps on order amongst chaos. I would argue that what we see here is not only an intermediate reference, but also a medial transposition, a story told in photographic form, narratives we all have hanging on our family walls, transposed here into picture book form and expanded upon. So we have this almost triple narrative effect. The primary narrative of the main text, the secondary narrative of the illustrated photographs, and a third narrative suggested by the scene of detritus, one within the book, one within the photos, one that goes beyond the confines of the book, a writerly ending in the Barthesian sense. The meaning is left open, offering the young reader the potential for the negotiation of understanding and interpretation, the potential to challenge their perceptions. How closely related or aligned are we as human and non-human? To what extent do we all mimic a civilized nature and mask our inner savage or our inner wild nature? Is Rufus fundamentally the product of nature or culture? What about us? And having examined some of the material, paratextual and intermediate elements of the book, the post-representational matter of the text, let us briefly consider the representation of matter in the text. And there's a huge amount that could be discussed here, but some brief observations. What is striking is the agency of nature and the non-human here. Nature is not a mere fictive backdrop. It is sentient and real and very much has agency in this story. The storm brings change. Rufus notes dangerous chaos in the storm's aftermath. Hannah the hen speaks of how invigorating it is when the weather shakes things up. The savagery of the storm is reflected in Rufus unleashing his inner savage. He speaks of a strong urge, emphasizing the connection between the natural and the cultural, a post-pastoral link between our inner nature and our outer nature, emphasized here in his transition from civilized to wild. Everywhere he goes, he's surrounded by temptation and potential to revert to savagery. Driven by primal urges of hunger, Rufus almost attacks his friend Hanny, but at the close of the story, he snaps back to cultured, civilized reality in conversation with Hanny, who is transformed from food to friend, but the boundary between the two has become less clear. So The Lost Thing is quite a different book at first perusal. However, there are also striking similarities between the two upon closer examination. A less recent offering, written by Australian author and illustrator Sean Tan in 2000. It's a quirky and humorous story about a boy who discovers a bizarre-looking creature while out collecting bottle tops at the beach. Having guessed that it is lost, he tries to find out who owns it or where it belongs, but the problem is met with indifference by everyone else who barely notices its existence. And once again, the materiality of this book is extremely significant. We see some of the process here in Tan's preliminary sketches. Its aestheticism is as important in this regard as the actual narrative. The entire process and product are inextricably linked and meshed with the thematic concerns of the fable itself. The 2000 Lothian Books edition is the size and length of what we might call a typical picture book. The paper has a high sheen finish, lending vibrancy to the illustrations. Aesthetically, not so much as a square millimetre of space left blank. Typical of Tan, the aesthetic density and complexity resists a simple reading. This is an image of the back cover in which the barcode, for example, becomes part of the story. Tan blurs the boundaries between scientific fact and fiction, but also renders the young reader acutely aware of the vibrant materiality of the book as a material object in itself. The narrative extends far beyond the inner pages. And as well as these peritextual observations, equally important are the epitextual considerations of the author-illustrator, his background and his motivations, which I argue are enmeshed in this circulating system, this interconnected, complex and dynamic web of materiality, demonstrating interactions between creator, process, product and young reader that forms the relationship within which agency occurs. So Tan is a critically acclaimed Australian author and illustrator, upon whom was bestowed the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award in 2011. Born in Perth to a Malaysian father and an Australian mother, he has stated that he finds the question of belonging constantly interesting, as his childhood lacked any strong cultural roots or a sense of historical context. And at the time when this book was written, over 20 years ago now, Tan was already an acclaimed artist and writer. This perhaps lends a certain self-aware confidence to his work and also motivates him to consider the nature of story and storytelling in a self-reflexive and self-reflective manner. It's also linked to the unique materiality of this book. His years of experience and his critical acclaim allowed him the artistic self-confidence and creative free rein to create this unusual text. So intermedial and intertextual references abound. Again, there's been much commentary on his not so subtle intertextual homages to works of art by renowned painters. What's perhaps more interesting in the context of this study is his use of intermedial devices to cast scathing commentary on social apathy and cultural conformity. An illustration of a family engrossed in TV programmes and newspaper stories, but completely oblivious to the far more interesting and unusual phenomenon and real phenomenon in their midst. Postcards sent to friends allude to the lost thing only in passing. And mundane bottle tops, upon closer inspection, each tell their own story. There are countless intermediate references to scientific study. Hours could be spent by a reader deciphering some of the collaged backgrounds created from his father's old scientific textbooks to suggest, in his own words, a world without imagination. So Tan understands the aesthetic power at play, as we see from his comments here. Each intermediate reference, each material object contributes to the book's vibrant materiality. Also evident here in the transformative power of literature, power that some humans and bureaucrats may be anxious to curtail, as is evidenced in the details of government stamps, inspection reports, and newspaper ads seamlessly embedded within the visual narrative. So Tan says all fiction is false. What makes it convincing is that it runs alongside the truth. The real world has lots of incidental details, so a painting also has to have that element of imperfection and irregularity, those incidental details. So material, aesthetic and intermediate detail is used, therefore, to bridge the gap between the imaginative and the real, allowing the reader to create, once again, those rhizomatic connections between the book and the world beyond the book. As we see here also in his ideas, his fascination with ideas of belonging, sort of reminiscent of our talk yesterday about Marianovich's Monsters, where humans are seen from the monster's perspective. So here Tan seems to ask, to what extent does the human belong, but to what extent does the non-human belong? So here human existence is that which is dull and almost lifeless. It's the non-human that's in fact more vibrant. I keep pressing the wrong button. Here. Thank you. And the creatures are seen as themselves in a vast network of agencies, which can be interpreted as forming their own narratives. This double-page spread depicts a utopia in comparison to the mundane, stagnant city, which is itself a storied world. But beyond the representation on the page, the book is itself a storied world, forming its own narrative. Its rich aesthetic complexity, intertextual and intermediate features, and paratextual assemblages place the material book as part of the interconnected, complex and dynamic web of materiality, which the young reader is inspired to explore both within and beyond the pages. So in conclusion, writing in the recently published Children's Cultures After Childhood, Wessling argues that we need conceptual and aesthetic vocabulary that will enable us to think, imagine, picture and narrate beyond the trite binary of culture versus nature in its various guises. And I propose that material eco-criticism and intermediality provide us with these necessary vocabularies at this crucial time. I also argue that multimodal forms of communication are complex material and semiotic structures in their own right, and that visual narratives align with Zapp's contention here, dealing with the basic relation between culture and nature in particularly multifaceted, self-reflexive and transformative ways. As Hombrecher and Wasilchenko maintain, children's literature is dominated by a paradigm of overcoming and dissolving boundaries. As scholars in children's literature at a time of ecological crisis, in seeking to overcome those boundaries, I believe it's more important than ever that we continue to ask, as Garcia Gonzalez and Desh Trihupsat do here, how are texts and media material and agentic? How are they present in children's and adults' entanglements with the world? Thank you.